The pond had been dying for 30 years. Not dramatically, not in the way that commands attention, the way that things die on the back end of a farm when a man has too many other things requiring his attention, and a silting pond ranks below everything else on the list. It had been a good pond once, half an acre, 12 feet at the deep end, stocked with bass and bluegill by the previous owner in the early 1970s. By the time Roy Casper inherited the property from his uncle in 1997, it was already shallow and weedy. By the time Roy retired from grain farming in 2019, it was 8 feet at the deepest point, filling progressively with the silt that a decades-long absence of dredging produces, and the far bank had slumped in a way that suggested the ground beneath it had been unstable for some time. Roy had decided to drain it in the spring of his 68th year, the point at which a man who has farmed 41 years either finds something to occupy his hands or begins to deteriorate. He was going to drain the pond, clean the basin, repair the far bank, and restock it. It would take the better part of a summer. He had the summer. What he did not have was the right equipment. The job required a tractor with sufficient hydraulic capacity to run a high-volume trash pump through the PTO across several days of continuous operation. Roy's remaining equipment after retiring was modest, a small utility tractor suited to property maintenance, not to driving a serious pump for days at a stretch. He needed something older, heavier, simpler, something he could run hard without worrying about it. He found it in April at a farm sale 20 miles north in Jefferson County. A Massey Ferguson 35, 1962, two-wheel drive, the diesel variant, a machine that had been sitting in a shed since the previous owner had stopped using it in the late 1990s. It started at the sale with a shot of ether and ran with the particular rattling confidence of an old diesel that has been dormant but not destroyed. The hydraulics worked. The PTO engaged. The sheet metal was rough and one rear fender was missing entirely, but the frame was straight and the tires held air, and the engine produced the steady low-end torque that a trash pump on a long drainage job requires. Roy paid $1,800 for it. He drove it home on the county road at the machine's top speed of 14 miles per hour, which took 40 minutes and which he did not mind at all. He set up the pump on the south bank of the pond on a Monday morning in early May. He primed the suction line, engaged the PTO, and watched the discharge begin to flow into the drainage ditch that ran along the east edge of the back 40 toward a low tile outlet. The water was dark with suspended silt. The pump moved it steadily. Roy set a lawn chair on the bank and watched for the first hour, adjusting the suction line depth twice as the level began to drop, then went back to the house for coffee and returned to check it every hour through the morning. By afternoon, the water level had dropped approximately 18 inches. The near bank's toe was beginning to emerge from the water, gray-brown with the particular clay that underlies that part of Jefferson County at any depth below the topsoil. Roy noted the drop, checked the pump, confirmed the suction line had not clogged on the debris that was concentrating as the volume decreased, and went back to the house for supper. The following morning, the level had dropped another 14 inches overnight. Roy could see the bottom in the shallower areas near the inlet, exposed mud with the texture of wet concrete and the smell of decades of decomposition. He checked the pump. He moved the suction line. He resumed his hourly checks. It was on the third day, in the early afternoon, when the water had dropped to the point where the center of the pond was showing perhaps 3 feet of depth over its lowest point, that Roy saw something in the mud of the far bank that did not belong there. He saw it first as a shape, a regularity in the slumped bank that was inconsistent with the natural profile of eroded clay, a straight line where natural erosion does not produce straight lines. A corner angle at a depth of perhaps 2 feet below the original waterline, now partially exposed as the level continued to fall. He stood on the south bank and looked at it for a long time. Then he walked around to the far bank through the knee-high grass and crouched at the water's edge. What he was looking at was metal. Specifically, it was the front axle assembly and partial hood section of a tractor, buried nose first in the bank at an angle that suggested the machine had entered the water from the bank above and sunk forward into the silt over many years, until the bank had effectively incorporated it. The metal was rusted to the particular deep orange-brown that ferrous metal achieves after decades of submersion in oxygenated water. The rubber on the front tires, what remained of it, had deteriorated to a crumbling material that no longer resembled tire rubber. But the axle casting was intact. The hood, or what remained of it, retained enough of its original profile to be recognizable as agricultural equipment from the pre-cab era. Roy looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he went back to the house, called his neighbor Dale Pritchard, who had a backhoe, and asked if Dale could come over in the next day or two for a job that required explanation in person. Dale said he could come Thursday. Roy said Thursday was fine. He did not tell anyone else. Not because he had a reason for secrecy, because he was a man who did not speak about things until he understood them, and he did not yet understand what he was looking at. Dale arrived Thursday morning with his backhoe on a trailer. Roy showed him the exposed section of the buried machine. Dale stood at the bank and looked at it with the expression of a man who has seen a lot of things on farms across 40 years of operating equipment for hire and has learned not to be immediately surprised by any of them. He said it was going to be a careful pull. The machine had been in the bank long enough to be structurally part of it, and pulling too aggressively would likely separate the visible front section from whatever remained buried behind it. Roy said he understood. He said to take whatever time was needed. Dale worked carefully. He used the backhoe bucket to excavate around the exposed section first, freeing the front axle from the surrounding clay without direct force on the machine itself. What emerged as he worked, slowly, over the course of 3 hours, was more than Roy had expected. The machine was largely intact, not complete. The seat was gone, the steering wheel shaft had corroded through, the engine was obviously beyond any recovery. But the frame was in one piece. The rear axle was present. The 3-point hitch casting was recognizable, and on the right side of the hood, partially protected from the worst of the corrosion by its position against the bank, a section of the original red paint remained in an area perhaps 6 inches square, faded but present. It was a Massey Ferguson. The profile of the hood, the proportions of the frame, the design of the front axle casting. Roy had been around enough old equipment to read those things even through heavy corrosion. Specifically, given the size and the general configuration, it was one of the larger models from the late 1950s or early 1960s. An MF-65, he thought, though he was not certain. Dale got a chain on the rear axle and pulled the machine clear of the bank onto solid ground. Roy hosed it down with a garden hose to remove the surface mud. Then he found what he was looking for. The serial number plate, on the right side of the instrument panel housing, protected enough by its recessed position that the stamped numbers were legible after he worked the surface with a wire brush for 20 minutes. He wrote the number in his notebook. He was not sure, at first, what to do with it. The machine had been in his pond, in the pond of the property he had inherited from his uncle, for long enough that it had become part of the bank. It was on his land. Beyond that, he did not know what it was or how it had arrived there or when. His uncle had died in 2012. His uncle had purchased the property in 1983 from the family that had farmed it since the 1940s. Roy had no knowledge of the property's history before his uncle's purchase beyond what was in the abstract of title, which described land transfers and easements and did not describe tractors. He started with the County Historical Society, which maintained records of farm equipment registrations from the mid-20th century in an archive that a retired county clerk had organized and donated in the 1990s. He drove to the Historical Society on a Friday afternoon and described what he had found and provided the serial number. The volunteer archivist, a woman in her 70s who had grown up in the county and knew its agricultural history in the specific way that people who have never left a place know it, searched for 20 minutes and came back to the table where Roy was sitting with a folder and a look that Roy could not immediately interpret. The serial number corresponded to a Massey Ferguson 65 that had been registered in Jefferson County in 1959. The registered owner was a farming operation called Hendrick & Sons, located on Route 4, which Roy recognized as the road that ran along the north boundary of the property he now owned. The Hendrick farm had bordered his uncle's property, had bordered the property Roy had inherited on the north. The archivist showed him one more document, a report from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, dated September 14, 1971, documenting a stolen equipment complaint filed by one Harold Hendrick of Route 4. A Massey Ferguson 65, serial number matching the number in Roy's notebook, reported stolen from the Hendrick farm. The report noted that the machine had not been recovered. The case had been closed as unsolved in 1974, 3 years after the report was filed, with no recovery and no identified suspect. Roy sat with that folder for a long time. Harold Hendrick had died in 2001. Roy had known this because his uncle had mentioned it. The two men had been neighbors for nearly 20 years and had not been close, but had maintained the functional relationship that adjacent farm operations require. Harold Hendrick had a son. The son's name was Gerald Hendrick, and he was 67 years old, and he still lived in Jefferson County, on a different property than the one he had grown up on, but in the same county where his father had farmed, and where a Massey Ferguson 65 had been reported stolen in the autumn of 1971 and never found. Roy drove home and sat in his kitchen for a long time before he made any decision about what to do next. He was a methodical man. He had farmed for 41 years, which is a profession that rewards methodical thinking and punishes impulsive action. And the habits of mind it had built in him were not habits he set aside when the situation was personal rather than agricultural. He was sitting with information that was going to be significant to another man, a man he did not know well, whose father had lost a machine 50 years ago and had filed a report that was closed unsolved and presumably never thought about again after a certain point. The machine had been in a pond on the property adjacent to the Hendrick farm. The machine had been there since at least 1971, which was the year it was reported stolen, possibly earlier. Roy did not know how it had gotten there. He did not know who had put it there. He knew what the serial number said and what the stolen property report said, and what the geography of the situation implied, which was that a machine reported stolen from the Hendrick farm had been in a pond on the adjacent property for somewhere between 50 and 55 years. That was what the evidence showed. Everything else was inference. He called Gerald Hendrick on a Saturday morning. The conversation was careful on both sides, in the way that a conversation between two men who do not know each other well but are about to discuss something significant is always careful at the beginning. Roy said he had found something on his property in the course of draining a pond, and that he believed it was connected to the Hendrick family. Gerald asked what he had found. Roy described it plainly: the tractor, the recovery, the serial number, the historical society records, the stolen property report. He read Gerald the serial number from his notebook. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Roy said Gerald's name to confirm he was still there. Gerald said he was there. He said the serial number was right. He recognized it, or thought he did, because his father had kept the stolen property report in a folder in his desk, and Gerald had found it when he cleared the desk after his father died, and had kept it without being sure why. He said he would have to look at the folder to confirm the number exactly. Roy said he understood. Roy said Gerald was welcome to come and see the machine at any time. Gerald came on Sunday afternoon. He was a lean man, gray-haired, with the hands of someone who had done farm work for most of his life and had not entirely stopped. He drove a pickup that was clean but not new. He parked in Roy's yard, and Roy walked him out to the back 40, where the machine was sitting in the grass beside the drained pond, the excavated bank behind it still raw and wet, the pond basin below them reduced to a flat expanse of gray mud with a shallow channel of remaining water at the center where the pump continued to run. Gerald stood beside the machine for a long time without speaking. He walked around it once. He crouched at the serial number plate, which Roy had wire-brushed clean, and looked at it. He stood up. He looked at the pond basin. Then he said something that Roy had not expected. He said he thought he knew who had put it there. Roy waited. Gerald said there had been a farmhand his father had employed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a man named Vernon Coates who had worked on the Hendrick farm for 4 years before leaving abruptly in the autumn of 1971. The same autumn, the tractor had been reported stolen. His father had suspected Vernon at the time and had said so to the sheriff's deputy who took the report. But suspicion was not evidence, and Vernon Coates had left the county before the investigation went anywhere, and the investigation had not gone far in any direction before it was closed. Harold Hendrick had believed for the rest of his life that Vernon Coates had stolen the machine. He had never been able to prove it and had eventually stopped talking about it, in the way that men stop talking about things they cannot resolve. What Gerald said next was the part that neither man had expected to be saying or hearing on a Sunday afternoon beside a drained pond in Jefferson County, Illinois. He said the property that Roy now owned, the property his uncle had purchased in 1983, had been sold in 1971 by a family named Aldrich. The Aldrich family had employed Vernon Coates as a part-time farmhand, in addition to the work he did for the Hendricks. Vernon Coates had worked both properties, he had known both farms, he had known the pond. Roy looked at the pond basin. He thought about the geography, the Hendrick farm to the north, the Aldrich property, his property, with its pond sitting in the back 40, close to the fence line between the two operations. A man who worked both farms would have known the pond and would have known that a tractor driven into it in the right season, when the water was high and the banks were soft, would disappear. Not immediately, not cleanly, but eventually, over years and then decades, into the silt and the slumped bank until it was simply gone. Vernon Coates had never been found. Gerald's father had written a letter to the county sheriff in 1978, 7 years after the theft, asking whether any further investigation had been conducted. The sheriff had written back that the case remained open, but that no new evidence had emerged. Gerald had found that letter in the same folder as the stolen property report when he cleared his father's desk. Roy and Gerald stood beside the machine for a while without talking. The pump on the bank continued to run. The discharge continued to flow into the ditch. The pond continued to drain. Roy asked Gerald what he wanted to do about the tractor. Gerald looked at it for a moment. He said the machine was on Roy's property. Roy said the machine had come off Gerald's father's farm. Gerald said his father had been compensated by the farm insurance at the time of the theft. Not fully, but compensated. He said the machine was 50 years past any practical question of ownership. He said what he had come to see was whether it was real, and it was real, and he had seen it, and that was what he had needed. He said his father had talked about that tractor until the mid-1980s, and then had stopped. He said the stopping had always seemed to him like a decision rather than a forgetting, like his father had decided that talking about it was less useful than not talking about it and had made the switch and kept it. He said seeing the machine told him his father had been right about Vernon Coates, which was something his father had known and been unable to prove, and which Gerald found he cared about more than he would have predicted before this afternoon. Roy said he understood that. The two men walked back to Roy's yard. Gerald thanked him for calling. Roy said there was nothing else he could have done. Gerald said some people would have buried it again and said nothing. Roy said those people existed. He said he was not one of them. Gerald said he could see that. Gerald Hendrick drove home. Roy went back to the pond and checked the pump and noted the level in his notebook and confirmed the discharge was running cleanly. He looked at the Massey Ferguson 65 sitting in the grass beside the bank, its corroded frame orange against the green of the back 40, its 50 years in the water behind it, and nothing in front of it except whatever Roy decided to do next. He had not yet decided. The machine was not operable and would never be operable again. The engine alone was a loss, and the corrosion throughout the frame and the axle housings was structural rather than surface. What remained was not a tractor in any working sense. It was an object, an artifact. 50 years in a pond gives a piece of equipment a specific gravity, not the gravity of machinery, which is the gravity of function and economics and field performance, but a different gravity, harder to name and harder to dismiss. Roy cleaned it again with the garden hose. He wire-brushed the serial number plate until the numbers were as clear as they were going to get. He took photographs of the plate, of the remaining paint section on the hood, of the machine in full from 4 angles. He sent the photographs to Gerald Hendrick with a message saying they were his to keep. Gerald replied the following day. He said he appreciated it. He said his father would have appreciated it. He said if Roy ever got that pond restocked, he'd like to come fish it sometime. Roy said he planned to have it stocked by August. He said Gerald was welcome anytime. The Massey Ferguson 35 that Roy had paid $1,800 for at the Jefferson County farm sale was still running the pump on the south bank, 11 days without complaint. The hydraulics held. The PTO ran true. The engine produced the steady torque that old diesels produce when they have been built well and not abused beyond what they were built for. He had bought the machine to drain a pond. The pond was draining. That was what he had needed it to do, and it was doing it. And the fact that the draining had produced something he had not anticipated was not the machine's doing. The machine had simply run the pump. What the pump had uncovered was the pond's business, 50 years in the making, waiting with the patience that only submerged things possess for someone to lower the water far enough to see what was there. Roy had lowered the water. The mud had given up what it had been holding. Now the pond was emptying cleanly, the basin drying in the May sun, the far bank raw and open where the backhoe had worked. In a few weeks, Roy would bring in clean fill for the bank repair and crushed limestone for the basin floor, and in August, the fish supplier from Carbondale would back his tank truck to the bank and release 400 fingerling bass and 600 bluegill into fresh water, and the pond that had been dying for 30 years would begin again. The Massey Ferguson 65 would not be in it. Roy had decided that before Gerald had driven home. He had not decided what would become of it, but it would not go back into the water. Some things that come up from the mud are meant to stay up. This was one of them. It had been in that pond since 1971. It had kept its secret for 53 years. Harold Hendrick had gone to his grave knowing the machine was gone, but not knowing where it was. His son had lived 67 years with a stolen property report in a folder, and a father who had stopped talking about it somewhere in the 1980s. The Massey Ferguson 35 on the south bank ran on. Roy sat in his lawn chair with his coffee and his notebook and listened to the engine and the pump and the water moving through the discharge into the ditch, and thought about what it means to drain a pond that has been holding something for half a century, and whether the Massey Ferguson 35 he had bought for the job had been the right machine or simply the available one. He decided it didn't matter which. It had done the work. The invoice arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February, and Harold Jennings read it twice before he picked up the phone. The service work had been routine, a pre-season inspection on his John Deere 7R 290, oil and filter change, hydraulic fluid service, a front axle greasing that his hired man had missed on the fall maintenance cycle, and a minor electrical repair on the cab lighting system that had been intermittent since November. Harold had authorized the work verbally when he dropped the machine off the previous Monday. He had not been given a written estimate because he had not asked for one, because in 17 years of doing business with the Callaway John Deere dealership in Cooper County, Missouri, he had not found written estimates necessary for routine maintenance work. He knew the labor rate. He knew the parts pricing. He could estimate a pre-season inspection within a reasonable margin, and the invoice had always confirmed the estimate within a range that did not require discussion. This invoice did not confirm his estimate. His estimate, based on the labor rate he had been paying for the previous 18 months, $98 per hour, and the scope of work he had authorized, had been approximately $680. The invoice in his hand showed a labor charge of $847, which at the hours logged by the service technician implied a labor rate of $121 per hour. Harold checked the arithmetic twice. It was correct. He called Callaway Equipment. The service manager answered and confirmed, without particular apology, that the dealership had implemented a labor rate adjustment effective January 1st. The new rate was $121 per hour. Harold asked why he had not been informed of the change before the work was performed. The service manager said the rate change had been posted at the dealership and reflected on the current rate schedule available at the service counter. Harold said he had not been in the dealership since November and had not seen any posted notice. He said he would have appreciated a phone call or a letter notifying him before work was performed at the new rate. The service manager said he understood Harold's position and that the rate was what it was. Harold asked to speak with the dealer principal. The dealer principal's name was Ed Calloway, the son of the man who had sold Harold his first John Deere tractor in 2006. Ed had taken over the dealership 8 years earlier when his father retired. Harold had maintained the business relationship through the transition, partly out of inertia, and partly because Ed had, in the early years of his tenure, been a competent dealer principal who had kept the service operation running at approximately the level Harold required. The relationship had been adequate. It had not been exceptional. Harold had been telling himself for 3 years that adequate was enough. Ed Calloway came on the line and confirmed what the service manager had said. The rate was $121. It had been posted. He said he was sorry Harold had not seen the posting. He said the rate increase reflected the current market for qualified agricultural technicians in the region, and that the dealership had to remain competitive in its compensation to retain the staff that Harold and his other customers depended on. Harold said he understood the business rationale. He said his concern was not with the rate itself, but with the manner of its implementation. He said that a 17-year customer running a 2,400-acre operation in the dealership's primary service territory deserved advance notification before a 23% labor rate increase was applied to a service invoice. Ed said he appreciated the feedback. He said he would take it under consideration for future rate adjustments. Harold said he would appreciate that. He paid the invoice. He drove home. He was not, by temperament, a reactive man. He had farmed 2,400 acres of corn, soybeans, and hay ground in Cooper County for 38 years, and farming for 38 years in Missouri produces either a reactive man or a deliberate one, and Harold had become deliberate the way most men become what they become, through the specific education of experience repeated until the lesson is no longer necessary to repeat. He had learned that reactive decisions in farming were usually expensive decisions, and that the cost of a reactive decision was often higher than the cost of the situation that had prompted it. So he did not call Ed Calloway back that evening to express further dissatisfaction. He did not begin researching alternative equipment brands that night. He paid the invoice, drove home, and went about his week. What he did do, beginning the following Monday, was keep a more deliberate record of his service interactions with Callaway equipment than he had been keeping before. Not because he had decided anything, because he had learned across 38 years that the situations that eventually required decisions were the situations that had been accumulating data for months or years before the decision became necessary, and that the men who made the best decisions were the men who had been paying attention before the moment of decision arrived. He pulled his service invoices going back 4 years from the file in his farm office. He was a systematic filer. Every invoice, every service record, organized by year and by machine in manila folders that occupied 2 drawers of a 4-drawer filing cabinet. He built a simple table on a yellow legal pad: year, service event, labor rate, parts markup, total cost, and a column for notes. It took him 2 evenings to complete the table from 4 years of records. The table showed 3 labor rate increases in 4 years, from $89 per hour in 2020 to $98 in 2022 to $121 in the current year. Each increase had been implemented without prior notification. Harold had not noticed the first increase at the time. The jump from $89 to $98 had been absorbed into the variation of normal service invoices and had not registered as significant until he was looking at the full table and could see the trajectory. The jump from $98 to $121 was larger and had registered immediately, which was why he was building the table. But the pattern, 3 increases, 0 notifications, was older than the current invoice. He also noted the parts markup trend. The table showed a gradual increase in parts pricing above the manufacturer's list that had moved from approximately 8% in 2020 to 14% in the current year. This was within the range of normal dealer practice, and Harold had no particular objection to it as a business model. But in the context of the labor rate trajectory, it represented a compounding cost increase that he had not been actively tracking because he had not been looking at it across time. He set the legal pad on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. The total cost increase in his annual service budget from Callaway equipment, comparing the 4-year-ago baseline to the current year on comparable work volume, was approximately $8,400. That was not a number that threatened his operation. It was a number that, in the context of an adequate rather than exceptional dealer relationship, asked the question he had been deferring. He did not answer it immediately. He went back to his preseason preparation. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the invoice conversation. Harold was in his equipment shed doing a preseason check on his planter when his cell phone rang with a number he did not recognize. He almost did not answer it. He answered it because he was at a point in the planter check that did not require his full attention, and because he had a general policy of answering unknown numbers during business hours on the grounds that ignoring unknown numbers during business hours was a habit that had once caused him to miss a time-sensitive grain offer. The caller identified himself as Paul Garrett, the owner of Garrett Farm Equipment, the Massey Ferguson dealership in Montague County, 28 miles west of Harold's farm. Harold knew the name of the dealership. It was visible from the highway he used occasionally to reach a sale barn in the next county, but had not done business there and had no particular relationship with it. Paul Garrett said he was calling to inform Harold that Garrett Farm Equipment would be implementing a labor rate adjustment effective 60 days from the current date, and that the adjusted rate would be $104 per hour, an increase of $6 from the current rate of $98. He said he was calling accounts in his service area to provide advance notice of the change so that any work Harold might be planning to schedule could be completed at the current rate if Harold preferred to do so before the adjustment took effect. He said he understood Harold was not currently a Garrett customer and that he was making the call anyway because Harold's operation was in his service area and because Paul Garrett considered advance notification of rate changes a basic courtesy that he extended to any farmer who might be affected. Harold stood in his equipment shed with the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Paul Garrett how he had come to have Harold's phone number and know the size of his operation. Paul said he maintained a service area database of farming operations above 1,000 acres within his territory, drawn from county property records and agricultural census data, and that he used the database for exactly this kind of proactive communication, not to solicit business, but to ensure that farmers in his territory had accurate information about his dealership's current service terms, regardless of whether they were current customers. He said he had been building the database for 4 years, and that the call he was making to Harold was the same call he made to every operation of Harold's scale in his territory whenever a rate or policy change was coming. Harold asked how long the advance notice window was on the current change. Paul said 60 days was his standard, and that he had extended it to 90 days on the previous rate adjustment 3 years ago when the increase had been larger than usual. Harold said that was a different approach than he had encountered from his current dealer. Paul said he was not familiar with how other dealerships handled these communications. He said he handled them this way because he believed a farmer making a service budgeting decision deserved accurate forward information and not a surprise on an invoice. Harold said he agreed with that. He said he appreciated the call. Paul said he appreciated Harold's time. Harold asked one more question before he ended the call. He asked what the current loaner equipment situation was at Garrett Farm Equipment. Paul said the dealership maintained 2 loaner tractors for planting and harvest season use, available to any account above 1,500 acres with a scheduled service relationship. Harold said he did not have a scheduled service relationship with Garrett. Paul said the question had been hypothetical. Harold said it had been. He thanked Paul for the call. He stood in his equipment shed for a moment after he ended the call. Then he went back to the planter check. He thought about the call while he worked, in the background way that a man thinks about something significant while his hands are doing something familiar. 2 phone calls, 3 weeks apart. One had been a confirmation of a rate increase that had already appeared on an invoice, delivered without apology and with a reference to a posted notice Harold had not seen. The other had been an advance notification of a rate increase that had not yet occurred, delivered to a man who was not a customer, with a 60-day window for adjustment. Harold was not a man who made decisions based on a single contrast. He was a man who made decisions based on patterns, and a single data point, even a striking one, was not a pattern. But a single data point, placed alongside the table on the yellow legal pad, was the beginning of a pattern, or the confirmation of one that had been forming for longer than he had been paying attention to it. He called Paul Garrett back the following Monday morning. He said he wanted to understand the Garrett dealership's service structure and parts availability before he made any equipment decisions, and that he was not calling to commit to anything but to gather information. Paul said that was a reasonable approach and that he would answer any question Harold put to him. Harold asked 5 questions in the following order. What was the current technician's staffing level and average years of experience on AGCO equipment? What was the parts distribution relationship with the AGCO regional hub? And what were the documented lead times on high-demand components? What did the loaner program structure look like in specific terms for an operation of Harold's size? What was the service scheduling window during peak planning and harvest season for accounts with a scheduled service agreement? And what happened when the dealership made a commitment to a customer and failed to meet it? Paul Garrett answered all 5 questions without deflecting any of them. His technician staff had 4 full-time mechanics averaging 11 years on AGCO equipment, with 1 senior technician at 19 years who handled major diagnostic work. The parts distribution relationship with the AGCO hub in Kansas City had produced an average lead time of 3.8 days on high-demand components over the previous 2 seasons, documented in his order logs which he offered to share. The loaner program covered 2 row crop tractors and 1 utility tractor, allocated by account size and seasonal need, with a formal scheduling system rather than a first-come basis. The peak season service window for scheduled service agreement accounts was guaranteed within 5 business days. And when the dealership failed to meet a commitment, Paul said this had happened twice in the previous 3 years. The response had been a direct conversation with the affected customer, a documented explanation of what had caused the failure, and a service credit applied to the next invoice. Harold said he appreciated the specificity. He asked if he could see the parts order logs Paul had mentioned. Paul said he would email them that afternoon. The logs arrived at 3:15. Harold printed them and went through them at the kitchen table that evening with the same methodical attention he had applied to his Callaway invoice history. The lead times were what Paul had described. There were 2 outliers, lead times above 10 days on specialty components, and both had been flagged in the log with notes indicating the reason for the delay and the customer communication that had accompanied it. Harold noted the outliers and noted the documentation around them. He built a second table on the legal pad, parallel to the first. Callaway Equipment's 4-year service history on the left. Garrett Farm Equipment's documented performance data on the right. He filled in what he knew and left blank what he did not yet know, which was most of the Garrett side, because Paul Garrett's dealership logs covered the dealership's aggregate performance, not Harold's specific operation, and the specific operation was what mattered. He drove to Garrett Farm Equipment on a Thursday morning in late March. Paul Garrett met him at the door and walked him through the service bay, the parts room, and the equipment lot without pressure and without a sales pitch. Harold looked at the Massey Ferguson equipment on the lot, the 8S and 7S units, the MF6S models, the utility tractors. He had operated Massey Ferguson equipment twice in his farming life, briefly, on borrowed machines during equipment transitions, and had found them competent without having formed a strong opinion of the brand. He asked about the fuel consumption data on the 8S265 specifically, which was the unit that would replace his primary 7R290. Paul pulled comparison figures from operators he had in the county. Harold asked if he could call two of them directly. Paul said he would ask their permission and call Harold back. The permission came the following day. Harold called both farmers. The conversations were direct and informative and confirmed what Paul's figures had shown without embellishing them. One of the farmers mentioned, without being asked, that the Garrett dealership had called him before implementing a rate change 2 years earlier, and that he had found the advance notice more useful than it had seemed at first, because it had allowed him to schedule a major service event before the increase, and had saved him a measurable amount on a large invoice. Harold thanked him and ended the call. He drove back to Garrett Farm Equipment the following Tuesday. He sat across from Paul Garrett at the dealer's desk and said he wanted to discuss a fleet transition. Not immediately, not for all his equipment, but beginning with his primary row crop tractor and proceeding from there based on how the first season performed. Paul said that was a sensible approach. They spent 2 hours on the numbers. The trade-in valuation on Harold's 7R290 was within the range Harold had established from current auction data, which he had compiled before the meeting, because he compiled relevant data before any significant financial conversation. The pricing on the MF8S.265 was fair against the manufacturer's list. Harold went home and looked at the yellow legal pad one more time. The two tables sat side by side. Callaway's 4-year record, Garrett's documented performance. The decision was not obvious in the way that easy decisions are obvious. It was the kind of decision that a careful man makes after building the information he needs and finding that the information points in a direction he had not been certain of until the information was complete. He called Ed Callaway the following morning. He said he was planning to move his primary row crop tractor to Massey Ferguson equipment and wanted Ed to know before the trade-in was submitted. Ed asked what had driven the decision. Harold described the invoice conversation, the table he had built from 4 years of service records, and the phone call from Paul Garrett. He described the call in the same neutral terms he described everything, what had been said, what it had told him, and what the contrast with his Callaway experience had represented when placed against the existing record. Ed was quiet for a moment. He said he appreciated Harold telling him directly. He said the advance notification practice was something he had not considered implementing, and that hearing Harold describe the contrast made him think it was worth considering. Harold said he hoped Ed would consider it. He said 17 years was a long customer relationship, and that the decision to move the first machine had not been easy, and that the direction of future equipment decisions would depend significantly on whether the service experience over the coming seasons warranted expanding or contracting the Callaway relationship. Ed said he understood. Harold thanked him. He ended the call and set the phone on the kitchen table beside the yellow legal pad. Outside, across his equipment shed lot, the John Deere 7R290 sat where it had been sitting since he brought it home from the preseason service in February. It would go to Garrett Equipment next week as part of the trade. It had been a good machine. It had run his ground reliably for 9 seasons and had not cost him anything he could not justify in the context of what it produced. What it had not produced in 9 seasons was a phone call from Ed Callaway telling him a rate change was coming. That phone call had come from a different direction entirely. Harold Jennings was 70 years old. He had been farming long enough to know that the details of how a business relationship was conducted were not small things. They were the things that told a man, over time and in the aggregate, whether the person on the other side of the relationship was thinking about the relationship or only about the transaction. A dealer who posted a rate increase and waited for the invoice to communicate it was thinking about the transaction. A dealer who called a farmer who was not even his customer to say a change was coming was thinking about something larger than that. The Massey Ferguson equipment would prove itself, or it would not. One season was not a verdict. Paul Garrett's service logs would match his actual performance, or they would not. That would also take time to know. What Harold already knew, before the first machine had turned a furrow, was which dealer had called him first.